Okay, welcome back. We need to talk a little bit about the economic culture in which we find ourselves, and that is best defined by the word capitalism. Capitalism is best defined as embodying two economic features. One is the free market, that goods can be exchanged freely, and this is an expression of our liberty, which liberalism will believe is a good thing. And in order to facilitate this, capitalism, and this is how Marx understands it, is basically equivalent to the institution of private property, that individuals can hold property, hold exclusive rights to it, and exchange it, give it away, destroy it as they see fit. This is the understanding, if you like, of the economic relations between individuals that John Rawls has and Nozick has. Since for Marx all modes of production are defined in terms of relations between the classes, let's see how capitalism structures these relations. There are three main classes in a capitalist society. There are those who own land and those who own capital. Okay, those are the capitalists and the landowners. They can be considered as one class because both of them have exclusive right to either the land or capital, and therefore can exchange that asset that they've just inherited for other goods. Okay, the labourers, the wage labourers, or the proletariat as they're generally known, are owners of labour power alone. They don't have any private goods, and therefore to survive, because if you think in a feudal system what you had was common tracts of land, you had your land and all you were done was tax 10% to give to the church and 10% to give to your baron, but the rest of your labour would come back to you in terms of subsistence. You would farm, you had an allotment, if you like. That's no longer possible under private property because land has been enclosed, it's owned. So the wage labourers have to exchange the only thing they own, which is their labour power, to exchange it for subsistence. Private property becomes capital, labour becomes capital, and the market is determined by buying and selling of goods between these three main classes, although, as I say, they're really two. Marx understands nature, as we know, as something through which man creates things, through which man creates a life world. Okay, nature belongs, in a sense, to the one who uses it. To use something is to give it the predicate of ownership. However, under a system of private property, nature already belongs to someone. I can't just use what I find or encounter in the world to express myself. Okay, that's the situation of private property. It's a very odd situation to find ourselves in, and that means the original relationships between men, which are ones of exchange, and just to give you a quote here, this is from the Grundrisse, the exchange originally found in production, which is an exchange not of exchange values, but of activities determined by communal needs and communal aims, would from the start imply the participation of individuals in the collective world of products. Now, this meant that a society grew up because people were exchanging activities. If you wanted the society to grow and generate more surplus time, surplus value, leisure, if you want, which is when you invest. Because if you think we're chained to nature, to free ourselves of nature, we must satisfy our needs. However, we can very quickly do that through society. We can give ourselves the conditions of subsistence quite easily, quite soon, quite quickly. In that situation, we can then even increase our efficiency. So if we have someone producing metal tools, for example, it makes the farming. But that means we have to cooperate. To cooperate means we have to exchange iron tools for food, because he won't be able to grow food whilst he's making iron. Okay, so what we do is we invent money, because of course if he gives you a piece of iron it can last 30 years. If you give him some food it'll last 2 weeks, so it becomes perishable versus imperishable. Money is a way of exchanging this. Money stands in for the activities. It embodies our objectified labour, our labour that's made into a product, and then we exchange this activity via these products because of their use, how useful they are. And that means what we have is a commodity or an activity exchanged to money, exchanged to a commodity. Money is an intermediate form that's used to facilitate this process. What happens with capitalism is that money is no longer an intermediate form, it becomes the end of the productive cycle, the value which we must produce. Because if you think in a feudal society, what we do is we produce surplus time, so we satisfy our needs, and that gives us free time, and in that free time we can self-determine ourselves, we can be free. Ideology then comes into play because a ruling class starts to invent religion, starts to invent shamanic rituals, and these in a sense direct our activity away from what we would want to do as a class to what they want as a class, the sort of Nietzschean Marxist critique of values. And what happens in these sorts of social systems is ideology, my self-understanding, actually is regressive, because it makes of my surplus time a further oppression. And if you like, history is meant to be the self-determination of all classes, the self-determination of free society. But capitalism is a stage that we go through after feudalism, and this is where he talks about the emergence of capitalism in the third volume of Capital. What does the primitive accumulation of capital, i.e. its historical genesis, resolve itself into? Insofar as it is not immediate transformation of slaves and serfs into wage labourers. Okay, so what were slaves beforehand and held in oppression through the threat of violence, and therefore weren't free, become wage labourers who believe by selling their labour they are free, although it's a form of ideology and therefore a mere change of form. It only means the expropriation of the immediate producers. That is the dissolution of private property based on the labour of its owner. And the idea is that capitalism is your labour does not create ownership anymore, which it always used to. Okay, so the point was you would oppress the labourer at the point of his activity. Capitalism changes it and oppresses the labourer at the point of his production. Okay, so it's no longer that what I make is my own, because I've got to use goods that belong to other people, I've got to use other people's electricity, I've got to use other people's factories, and therefore I sell my labour to them rather than, selling my product to them. Private property as the antithesis to social collective property, and that's a very important antithesis we get there, exists only where the means of labour and the external conditions of labour belong to private individuals. So you can see why private property is so, and enclosure, and the idea that the world belongs to people, that assets are already owned before we are born. Self-earned private property, that is based, so to say, on the fusing together of the isolated, independent, labouring individual with the conditions of his labour, is supplanted, is wiped away by capitalistic private property, which rests on exploitation of the nominally free labour of others, on wage labour. Now it's clear that Marx thinks that capitalism is a bad thing for man, and the private property is a form of oppression. But that's what we've got to work to and understand. So what does it mean? In capitalism, as we've said, the chain where I exchange my activity for money to exchange for another activity, or products if you want to think of them like that, now becomes money exchanging for a commodity, exchanging for more commodity. Okay? And that's the way, and with that more money, I can then buy things. The aim of an exchange is to increase one's capital, one's money. That's the end of the productive process. The end product of one's labour is capital and not the product of the actual activity. It's no longer that I farm to make goods to satisfy my needs. I work in order to get money to buy the satisfaction of my needs, and not the product of the actual activity. That becomes a commodity to be sold to raise capital. That's what the products are. So how can an amount of capital create a product that will then be sold for more money than the labour and the means of production expended and created it? And this is one of Marx's problems, is how the product takes on more value, how the capitalist makes money. And the only way, he says, is the capitalist can only make money because if you think about it, he puts the basic materials into the production of the product. They can't increase in value because they stay the same or are degraded by the productive process. He puts the factory in and the means to produce it, but again, they stay the same at the end of the productive process. So the product has increased in value because it's been put together, made, and it's the making that increases the value, which is the labour. So it's the labourer that actually adds the value to the productive process. And the only way the capitalist can make money is by paying the labourer less than his labour is worth and value. And that's his general place. So there is his sort of idea that the materialised labour, the product, dominate the labourer. Okay, the worker does not see or use the means of production to realise his own or her own essence. The means of production use the worker to perpetuate the system of private ownership, because by increasing the capital of the capitalist can therefore reinvest and keep people in a more oppressed position. Now, I've left some notes of Marx's understanding of private property and the free market and capitalism below, but I just want to go over it in a bit more abstract, a sort of simpler sense. And this is it. Okay, so capitalism, as I say, is understood as the free market, which is that property, lands, material, labour, is held by individuals under a secure system of property rights. Now we know that people own things. You've got your computer in front of you, it's yours, you've bought it, you could sell it, you could give it away, you could smash it up, no one could stop it. If someone takes it away without your permission, that's stealing and theft. Goods are produced for profit, not for demand, not by demand for the satisfaction of needs. Okay, all goods are distributed by voluntary exchange and the market ruled by supply and demand. And free competition exists. Anyone can produce and sell goods, including labour, at whatever price they like. Okay, now, in order to understand this, it's best to look at the right-hand side, and this is, if you like, a socialist or planned economy. And the point to make is neither of these economies have ever existed. They're very pure, and it's obviously the case. So, for example, in the free market, all goods are distributed by voluntary exchange. Well, plutonium's not. We've had monopolies in the postal office. We've had monopolies in the energy market. UK is probably one of the freest markets, actually. It's privatised nearly everything. Okay, most other places hold on to state monopolies where they see that they are useful things for the society as a whole. The alternative to the planned economy tells us that the state, in the name of the people, controls all the property. It's collectivised, it's nationalised. So, for example, the education system belongs to us all. The NHS belongs to us all. Imagine that the clothes makers belong to us all. Production is aimed at satisfying the needs of people, not for profit. So the goal of production is not to create capitalists and more money. It's to satisfy the needs of the people. Distribution is by central allocation and not by trade. So, for example, what you have is big computers modelling what people will need, how many shoes they'll need, how many clothes they'll need, where they will need them, where it's going to be colder. There'll have to be heavier coats in Scotland than the south of England, for example. So distribution is controlled and not the state has ultimate control over who may produce and how much of each good. So you can't just set up your company. Now, the planned economy has two major problems. One is liberty. It becomes very homogenous. It's not easy for an individual to express their own individuality. Now, that's not a problem for Marx, because Marx thinks that's a sort of fake liberty. It's not real self-determination. And we'll see that as we go on. The other problem with the planned economy is it just doesn't work. It's very inefficient. It gets things wrong. They generally produce not enough coats when it's a cold winter. They don't produce enough energy. You have to have blackouts. It's always been proven to be very inefficient. And the free market, on the other hand, is very efficient because it's a system of meaning, a system of exchange of messages. So, for example, take a rather pertinent example with the pandemic at the moment. Suddenly there were a lot of companies set up to sell PPE and also to start investigating vaccines. Why? Because there was a lot of money to be made. Okay, now that means that if there's money to be made, lots of people are going to do that. If, however, someone produces the vaccine and there's no more money to be made, the capitalists pull their money out and put it somewhere else. Okay, so if you like, supply and demand is a system of messages that keep it efficient. And also, profit gives a reason to respond to this information. It means that we're producing things. So needs, in a sense, are satisfied better. And that's, if you like, the hidden hand of Adam Smith. It's not anything metaphysical, the hidden hand. It's just this idea that it works. And if you like, there's a sort of utilitarian argument for the free market, which you'll find in David Hume, Adam Smith, J.S. Mill. it's the free market is just more efficient than a planned economy. It just works better. Okay, and that is a pretty strong argument, actually. Maybe with better AI, maybe with better computers, the planned economy and collectivized will actually improve a bit better. However, let's move on, because there's the other justification is that it is, and there's a justification you will find in people like Hegel, and also sorry, just in Hegel for now, and I can't remember who else, but is the expression of free will. You know, it is the expression of one's desires. Sorry, Nozick, of course, it's the free market is the best way to express free will. And Marx is a obvious successor of Hegel, and he questions this. Why? Well, the free market leads to unjust inequalities. Okay, the next page on Canvas, I've put up a very famous Dutch economist's illustration, if you like, of the inequality in the world generated by the free market. And there's also a video which I've not watched all the way through, which gives us some more up-to-date statistics. Okay, but inequality may not be wrong on its own, and we know someone like Robert Nozick thinks it's not. It's an expression of liberty. It's a result of respecting people's rights and liberty. Inequality happens. People have to be responsible for it, and as I've tried to suggest is for Marx, that's a form of ideology. It's a form of looking at moral luck and social luck as just the way things are. Is a way of protecting those who are asset heavy, asset rich. So the first problem, which I've got as number 2 here, is that the free market leads to unjust inequalities. The second is that it's very wasteful. There are these external negative externalities, as they're called, but the most obvious one is climate damage. You know, in order to overproduce, in order to make huge profits, people don't really care about health and safety, don't care about pollution. You know, if you put a filter on your factory, that costs money. If you get rid of it, you can make more money, more profit. So the point is that the market is these negative externalities which damage, you know, that no one takes into account as costs and they just ignore, but they are actually costs just because they don't get expressed as money yet. Secondly, because it leads to boom and bust. You know, you can imagine that of all the people at the moment investing in producing a vaccine, a lot of them are going to be wasting their time and they're going to lose their jobs. And as soon as someone gets the vaccine, that's going to send their share price shooting up and send a lot of smaller companies out of business. And the market is very wasteful. It has booms and busts. It overproduces, and we've got to throw away goods. You know, say it's almost Christmas. There's bound to be a new toy, which is the most famous toy ever. I mean, it'll be, I don't know, a Pokemon or some sort of teddy bear that talks and looks horrific. And everybody will want one. They'll be very, very expensive. Then everybody will buy them. Then they'll overproduce them. Then someone will copy one and make it look a lot like it. And then you will find most of these thrown out in about 2 years' time. And that's what the market is. It's wasteful. Now, that in itself are just observations. Marx's criticisms of the free market is that firstly it's exploitative, which is wasteful of human beings, and that it alienates the worker. Now, I'm not going to talk about alienation yet. That's going to be another separate talk. But I will talk about exploitation and show that alienation is the main criticism that Marx has of capitalism and the free market. So, of all the Marxisms out there, it is hard sometimes to see what the essential ingredients of a Marxism are. But there are certain features which seem to recur again and again, but not always together. You've got the primacy of economic structures and political explanation. He's a methodological holist. The primary unit of explanation is the relation between classes and society. Okay. Also, he's committed to material equality as opposed, in addition to formal political equality. And this is important because remember, Nozick says inequality arises because of free choices. Formal political equality is recognizes people's liberty to do what they want and therefore be responsible for their actions and the outcomes of their actions. Marx says that's not enough. You've got to have material equality, because starting with different assets leads to unfairness. Okay. More importantly is the idea of freedom and self-determination. As I've said, and I will talk about this more in other talks, that the idea that liberty as negative liberty, or the idea of just satisfying my wants without obstruction, is a sort of poor understanding of liberty or free will. Now, for a Marxist theory to be normative, it needs to show that a socialist society is morally legitimate or just. It is worth aspiring to in terms of our normal moral categories. So a socialist society is more than just, say, a welfare state or the free market as a way to distribute goods. Okay, it has to begin with a central or valuative claim in Marx's writings. Marxists reject the idea that justice is actually compatible with private property in the free market. Marxists hold that private property is inherently unjust. Okay, so it's not just that capitalism isn't the best way to satisfy our goods. It's not just that capitalism is a necessary step in historical development that we've now got to overcome. Private property is inherently unjust. Okay, it's a form of ideology. If we think the world belongs to individuals, if we think things can be owned, okay, it's in the interests of the system itself, capitalism, and not the members of society, the classes in society. As I say, there are two forms of this critique. There's the one about exploitation and the one about alienation. Okay, so private property is alienating. That, I think, is the important critique, and that's the one we'll get on to after this. Okay, and that comes from Hegel. That's Marx's Hegelianism. But he also is a bit Kantian. Private property is unjust because it is exploitative. Why is it exploitative? Well, imagine a conversation, if you like, between two people. One's a worker and the other one's a capitalist. The capitalist says, I want to make X. Okay, will you labour for me? And the worker says this. He says, look, hold on a minute. What does it mean to make X? We're going to need your factory, and you're going to have to buy the bare materials, and then I'll put my labour in. So your costs are going to be 3. How much are we going to sell the thing for? And the capitalist says, oh, we'll sell it for 6. And the labourer then says, well, my part will be 3 then. So 3 and 3. So the product is the means of production, the materials, plus the labour. That's what it's made up of. Okay. Now, that means that we, the workers, should cooperate with you, the capitalist, so long as we receive a fair portion of the value we produce. Yes, but we, the capitalists, will only cooperate with you, the workers, if you receive a less than fair portion of the value you produce. Why would the capitalist say that? The capitalist says that because his motivation is to produce as much profit as possible for himself. He is going to be in competition with other capitalists, and he therefore has to get his costs as low as possible to undercut them, but to still make a profit. So we have a sort of standoff. The workers will only work if they get paid fairly, i.e. their labour is recognised for the value it adds to the product. And the capitalists will only invest if the labourers accept a less than fair portion of the value that's produced, because they want to take the rest. Now, this ignores reification. Okay, that's something I should say. It ignores the symbolic value of goods. You know, a Ferrari probably costs the same as a Nissan to make, but it's also reified. It's worth more in terms of prestige, which is something we may talk about. I don't know if I go to it, but it's worth bearing in mind. But I'm going to ignore it here because it's simpler. Now, understood like this form, who is going to blink in this conversation? Well, the point is the capitalist is already asset rich and he can satisfy his needs. The labourer cannot satisfy his needs without selling the labour. So he is forced to selling his labour, whereas the capitalist is not forced into investing. So there's already an asymmetry. Furthermore, there are fewer capitalists than there are labourers. And the labourer is replaceable by someone else. So if he doesn't agree to a less than fair portion of the value produced, someone else will. And that makes them substitutable. They're getting replaced by machines. They are moved to one side. Their labour is broken up into small bits so that anyone can do it. It's not specialised anymore. They have no special talents, so on and so far. So basically there's an asymmetrical power here. The capitalists hold all the cards and therefore can exploit the worker by paying them less. Now, why do I think this is the Marxist critique? It's definitely there. Material equality would get rid of this. Okay, if everybody owned the same, if there were no such things as capitalist, boom, this would disappear, this form of exploitation. And exploitation occurs and it is bad. But the point is, exploitation does not lead to the abolition of private property. You could use the difference principle to justify inequality. You could make sure that there was a minimum wage. You could make sure that there was a welfare state to protect people who are least well off. Okay, so none of that would lead to the abolition of private property exploitation. It just means we need a fairer negotiating system. And if you think that's what John Rawls was presented with the original position, if these two were put in the original position and the worker didn't know he was a worker and the capitalist didn't know he was a capitalist, then they wouldn't get an agreement. But neither of them, they would only get an agreement along the sides of Rawls's theory of justice. So in a sense, it would be consistent with capitalism, yet a sort of social, a socially democratic welfare state form of capitalism, which is what John Rawls puts forward. So there's one reason I don't think it's Marx. The second reason here is that it seems to suggest that the capitalists themselves are free, and, if you like, the slaves are the workers and labourers. But Marx again and again tells us that capitalists themselves are as alienated in capitalist societies, in capitalism. The capitalists themselves are not free and choose to self-determine. They're in competition with each other. They believe that the production of profit is the only goal. They themselves are trapped in these values and see themselves as an individual. They have a corrupted self-understanding as well, their own class. And the relations between the class means both classes are alienated. So there's not the exploitation critique is definitely a part of what Marx is doing, that capitalism is exploitative, but the real criticism is alienation, which we'll look at in depth now.